The river had always whispered its secrets to those who cared to listen, its surface smooth and deceptive, hiding the violence beneath. It was a silent witness, a keeper of lost stories. For years, the only evidence of its deeper truth was the faded image of a ferry, once a symbol of progress, now reduced to little more than a relic of history. The haunting presence of this wreck, submerged in the depths of the river, had been forgotten by most, but not by all. And then there was the one question that no one could quite answer. How many lives are truly lost in disaster, and how many are erased from the record forever? It is strange, the way memory works. How some things remain fresh, vivid, and others, no matter how important, fade away until they vanish altogether. History is a collection of these memories, some cherished and preserved, others drown in the currents of time. But what if the memory itself is the most important part of the story, far beyond the facts? What if the names left out, the people whose lives remain forgotten, are the ones who carry the weight of the truth? For the passengers of the ill-fated river ferry of 1876, this was the cruelest aspect of their legacy. They had been swallowed by history, their names erased, and their stories left incomplete. When we think of disasters, we often think of the immediate aftermath, the chaos, the horror of storm, or an accident that no one could have predicted. The headlines flash, the numbers are tallied, and soon the world moves on. But for those left behind, the tragedy becomes a haunting, a question that lingers unanswered. It is in these lingering questions that the true mystery often lies. Because some stories are never told, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too dangerous, too painful, or simply inconvenient. The river ferry disaster of 1876 was one such story. On the surface, it seemed simple enough. A storm had come out of nowhere, and the ferry, caught in its fury, had capsized. A few bodies were found. A few others were never recovered. The town's people, those who had been spared the wrath of the river, went back to their lives, carrying on as though nothing had happened. But if you listened closely enough, you could hear the river's voice, low and mournful, as it murmured about the lives lost, not just to the storm, but to something far more insidious. The stories of those who had been aboard the ferry seemed to flicker at the edges of memory, never quite fully formed, like shadows just out of reach. The ferry was a lifeline for the people who lived along the riverbanks, connecting villages and towns, ferrying passengers and goods alike. It had been a staple of daily life, its presence as natural as the flow of the river itself. But that day when the storm hit, the river became something else. It was no longer a provider but a taker, and those on board the ferry were caught in its grip, helpless to escape. The storm came without warning, a flash of lightning, the sudden howl of wind, and then the torrential downpour. Those aboard the ferry must have known, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. The sky darkened in an instant, and the calm waters of the river were transformed into a churning, violent sea. The passengers scrambled for shelter, some clinging to the side of the vessel, others rushing toward the wheelhouse in a desperate attempt to regain control of the ship. But the storm was merciless, and the ferry, once a sturdy vessel, was no match for the fury of nature. The wheelhouse, the heart of the ferry's operation, was crucial to navigating the rough waters. But on that day, it was the first to fail. The storm battered it mercilessly, and the crew struggled to steer the ship through the rising waves. It was clear, even in the chaos, that something had gone horribly wrong. The wind howled louder, the water surged higher, and then, with a terrible groan, the ferry began to capsize. The passengers, thrown into the cold, violent water, must have fought for their lives. Some, perhaps, clung to debris, while others sank beneath the surface. There was no time to save everyone, and as the ferry tipped, the screams of those still aboard were swallowed by the storm, lost to the river. When the wreck was finally found, only fragments of the story remained. The bodies that were recovered were those of the fortunate few, the ones who had managed to hold on, to survive just long enough for help to reach them. But for the others, for those whose names were never written down, for those who disappeared into the murky depths, there was only silence. In the immediate aftermath, the town mourned its dead, but soon the memories began to fade. As with all tragedies, the shock wore off, and life returned to normal. The river, however, did not forget. Beneath the surface, the ferry still lay, its wreckage a silent monument to what had happened. But for most, the disaster was little more than a footnote in the town's history, a momentary tragedy quickly buried by time. But then, years later, something strange happened. The first expeditions to the wreck were launched, and divers descended into the river to uncover the ferry's remains. What they found, however, was not simply the twisted metal and broken wood of a sunken ship. Among the wreckage was something far more unsettling. The wheelhouse, once the command center of the ferry, had been completely intact, untouched by time. But inside, there was something else, a relic that seemed strangely out of place. It was a personal object, an item that should not have been there. Something that suggested the ferry's final voyage had been more complicated than anyone had realized. The object was a journal, its pages yellow with age, its ink faded but still legible. It was immediately clear that it had been written by someone who had been aboard the ferry, a passenger whose name had never been mentioned in the records. The discovery of this journal was the first clue that something about the disaster was not as it seemed. As the diver carefully opened the pages, a name appeared, one that had never appeared in any of the official documents, one that had been erased from history: Samuel Grayson. Grayson's name was not recorded anywhere. No entry in the passenger logs, no mention in the official reports. It was as if he had never existed, or at least, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that his existence would never be known. The journal, once discovered, offered a glimpse into his life, a life that had been hidden from the public eye. But the more the journal revealed, the more questions it raised. Who was Samuel Grayson? What had brought him onto the ferry that day? And most haunting of all, why had he been erased from the historical record? What was it that had been so important, so dangerous, that even his name had to be forgotten? The river's voice had whispered for years, but only now, decades after the disaster, was it beginning to speak the truth. As the mystery of Samuel Grayson's disappearance unfolded, the questions began to pile up, one after another. What was the river hiding, and why had it chosen to keep this secret for so long? The river had always been more than just a body of water to the people who lived by its banks. It was their lifeline, their connection to the outside world, their provider of sustenance and transportation. The ferry was the embodiment of this connection, an ironclad assurance that no matter how treacherous the waters, there was always a way across. For years, the ferry had crisscrossed the river's vast expanse, its familiar whistle signaling the beginning of each journey. In the towns and villages that lined its shores, the ferry was as much a part of the landscape as the trees and the earth. Its rusted frame and billowing smokestacks were as familiar to the locals as the faces of their neighbors. It was trusted, dependable, even comforting in its routine, an unspoken promise that no matter what came, it would always make the journey. But like all promises, it was only as strong as the forces that upheld it. And the forces of nature, unpredictable, wild, untamable, have no loyalty to promises. The ferry, in all its might and endurance, was vulnerable to the whims of the elements, and on that fateful day in 1876, it would meet its match. The storm had arrived without warning. One moment, the river was calm, the skies clear, and the next, the world was engulfed in darkness. It wasn't the kind of storm that could be predicted by the weather patterns or the local signs that people so often relied upon. This storm had come from nowhere, like a beast emerging from the depths of the river itself. In those early moments, the crew of the ferry must have known something was wrong, but the realization came too late. The ferry was already caught in its grip, and the worst was yet to come. What made the storm even more terrifying was its speed. The suddenness with which it tore through the calm morning was something the crew had never seen before. They must have felt a sense of dread rising in their chests, knowing that they had no time to react, no time to prepare. The wheelhouse, the very heart of the ferry's navigation system, was their last hope of steering the ship through the treacherous waters. But as the winds howled and the waves grew taller, it was clear that no one could have predicted just how powerful the storm would be. The passengers must have felt it too, that prickling sense of dread, the feeling that something irreversible was happening, that the river had shifted its allegiance and was no longer a safe passage, but a force of destruction. The ferry's passengers, a mix of men, women, and children, had no warning. They were at the mercy of the storm, caught off guard by its fury. Some may have clung to the sides of the ferry, desperate to maintain some sense of control, while others, more passive, might have felt an odd resignation. The ship lurched violently, and the sound of the storm was deafening. Roaring winds, crashing waves, the creaking of the ferry's timber as it groaned under the pressure. For a brief moment, it might have felt as though the ferry was alive, struggling against a force of nature that seemed to bear down on it from all sides. It is impossible to imagine the panic, the frantic movements of the passengers as the storm ripped into their world. There would have been confusion, fear, and a strange sense of disbelief. The storm wasn't just an event. It was a personal assault on everything the people had come to expect from life on the river. The ferry was meant to be a bridge, a connector between worlds, but now it had become a prisoner to the violent river, its every movement dictated by forces it could not control. In the wheelhouse, the captain and crew had been battling not just a storm, but their own mounting fear. The storm had taken them by surprise, but it was becoming increasingly clear that survival was no longer a matter of skill or control. It was a matter of luck, of chance. And as the ferry lurched again, this time with a sickening tilt, the crew must have realized that their chances were dwindling. No amount of experience could have prepared them for this. The storm was too strong, too unpredictable. In those final moments before the ship tipped, there was nothing anyone could have done but hold on, hoping that the river would spare them. But the river was relentless, and as the wheelhouse failed, so did their hope. The ferry, once a symbol of strength and reliability, now lay at the mercy of the storm. It was no longer a vessel. It was a helpless object at the mercy of nature, doomed to the same fate as those caught within it. And then, with a terrible groan, the ferry tipped. For those aboard, the moment must have been a surreal blur, a terrible realization, a rush of water, and then nothing. The sound of splintering wood, the cries of panic, and then the cold, merciless embrace of the river itself. The survivors would later recount the chaos, the disorientation of the moment when everything went wrong. Some of them will remember the fear, the desperate scramble for safety as the ferry plunged into the depths. But others, perhaps, would remember something else, something more profound. The moments of stillness that followed the initial chaos, when the river seemed to calm as if it too had had enough of the violence. It is in those moments, those final seconds before the ship completely capsized, that the true horror must have settled in. The realization that there was no way out, that the river had claimed them, that no one would be spared. When the ferry finally sank beneath the surface, the river seemed to reclaim its own. It had swallowed the ship whole, pulling it down into the depths where it would lie, untouched by time or memory for decades. The passengers, those whose bodies were recovered, became part of the tragic history of the town, their names recorded in grim detail for posterity. But for the others, the ones whose bodies were never found, the river had kept them, had hidden them, just as it had kept the ferry. Their names would never be known, their stories never told. They had become part of the river's vast, unspoken history, lost forever in the dark depths. And yet, even in the absence of their names, even in the fading memory of the disaster itself, the river would not forget. The people who had lived in the shadow of the river might have moved on, their lives restored to normalcy as the years passed. But the river carried a memory of that day, hidden beneath its surface. It was a memory the townspeople would rather not acknowledge, a part of their history they would rather erase. But the river, in its own way, held on to it, holding on to the stories of the lost passengers, the forgotten souls who had been erased from the records, their lives silenced by the storm and the river's cruel embrace. For years, the town lived with the faintest recollections of that day, brief mentions in the local papers, whispers from the survivors, and occasional comment made by those who had been there. But soon, the memory faded into background. The river continued to flow, unyielding and constant, its surface smooth and unbroken. And yet, beneath it, there was something waiting to be uncovered. The secrets of that day had not been fully revealed, and the river's whispers would continue to echo long after the town had moved on. It was just a matter of time before someone would hear them. The storm had torn the ferry apart, and as the wreckage sank beneath the dark, turbulent waters, a silence seemed to fall over the scene. The chaos of the moment was gone, leaving only the cold, indifferent flow of the river. Yet that silence, heavy and ominous, spoke volumes. For the survivors, it was as if time itself had slowed, as if the river had drawn them into some suspended moment, holding them in a state between life and death, between reality and something more haunting. The horror of the disaster didn't end when the storm subsided. It lingered in the aftermath, in the broken bodies, in the memories that would never be fully formed. And for those who had survived, the questions will haunt them for the rest of their lives. What happened? Why had the storm come with such ferocity? And why had the ferry, once so steadfast, been destroyed so completely? In the immediate hours after the disaster, a few survivors made their way to the shore, clinging to whatever they could find. They had seen the ship go down, heard the terrifying crash as it tipped and splintered, and then they had been thrown into the water, fighting for their lives against the current. The shock of the experience had left them numb, their bodies bruised and battered, but their minds were worse off. The emotional toll would take much longer to process. It was not just the loss of life they had witnessed, but the loss of something more intangible, the loss of belief that the river, the ferry, the very fabric of their world, could be so easily torn apart. The survivors, shaken to their core, could not begin to comprehend what had just transpired. How had they ended up in the river at all? How had something so familiar, something they trusted with their lives, turned into a death trap so quickly? As they crawled from the water and stumbled to safety, the survivors must have felt the weight of that question pressing down on them. They had no answers, no explanations, only the strange, unsettling feeling that they had been part of something much bigger than themselves, something that defied the logic they had always relied on. And in that silence, after the storm had passed, there was a haunting realization that they might never fully understand what had happened to them. All they knew was that something was wrong, that the storm had not been just a freak act of nature, but something more deliberate, something more sinister. But how could they prove it? Who would believe them? And so they moved on with their lives, the memories of storm and the wreck drifting in and out of their minds like fragments of a dream they couldn't quite hold on to. In the days that followed, the town rallied together to search for the wreckage. The river, now calm again, had given up its victims, but only a few bodies were found. The rest, lost to the deep, would never be recovered. The names of the dead were written down, and the survivors returned to their homes, their lives forever altered by the tragedy. But even as the town tried to move on, there was something strange in the air, a subtle unease that none could quite place. The storm had been fierce, yes, but storms came and went, and ships were lost in the river all the time. What was different about this disaster? Why did it feel as though something had been taken? Not just lives, but something far more important. The ferry's owners, eager to distance themselves from the tragedy, quickly began to sweep the incident under the rug. The wreck was written off as an accident, a freak occurrence that no one could have predicted or prevented. It was the river's fault, they claimed. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the ferry had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The townspeople, in their grief and confusion, reluctantly accepted this explanation. What else could they do? After all, who were they to question the power of nature? They went on with their lives, returning to their routines, pretending that nothing had happened. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling that the story didn't end with the sinking of the ferry. The disappearance of certain bodies was an unsettling part of the tragedy. The survivors spoke of seeing people go overboard, of hearing desperate cries in the wind. But when the wreck was finally located and the search began, only a handful of bodies could be recovered. The others had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. It was as though the river had claimed them entirely, pulling them into its depths without a sound. Some said it was the current, the fierce rush of water that had carried them away. But others whispered something else, that the river, in its own way, had chosen to keep them, to hide them from the world. And in their absence, the survivors were left with a strange emptiness, a hole in their hearts where those lost lives should have been. There was no closure, no finality, only the cold, unforgiving water. As time passed, the disaster became little more than a footnote in the town's history. The storm, the wreck, the missing bodies, they were all filed away in the minds of the townspeople, who went on with their lives. The river, once a source of life, had become a reminder of loss, but also a symbol of nature's ultimate power. It had taken what it wanted, and now it was calm again, its surface smooth and undisturbed. The townspeople did their best to forget, to move on, as they always did. They found new things to occupy their minds, new births, new weddings, new disasters to take the place of the old one. But something was missing, something the river had taken that no one had yet fully understood. The ferry, in its watery grave, still held its secrets, secrets that were buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The years passed, and the disaster slowly faded into the past. The ferry's wreck was no longer a subject of conversation. The storm became just another story to tell around the fire, a tale of misfortune, of nature's fury. But for those who had been there, the memories never truly went away. The fear, the uncertainty, the confusion, it all lingered just beneath the surface, a faint whisper that could not be ignored. The people who had been on that ferry, who had lived through disaster, would never forget, and in their silence, in the absence of clear answers, the questions began to take root. What really happened that day? Why had the ferry sunk so quickly, so violently? Why had some people vanished, never to be found? What had the river taken from them, and why? The town had long since moved on, but the mystery remained, and it would not be silenced. The ferry's wreck, the lost passengers, the unanswered questions, they would all come alight again in ways no one could have predicted. The river had not given up its secrets, and sooner or later, someone would come looking for them, and when they did, they would find something far more unsettling than they could have ever imagined. The truth, buried beneath the river's surface, had been waiting all along. The years that followed the tragedy brought a strange sense of peace to the town, a fleeting calm after the storm's fury. Time, as it always does, dulled the sharp edges of the disaster, transforming it into a quiet memory that lingered at the periphery of the townspeople's minds. The river, once a site of terror, had returned to its familiar rhythmic flow. It had calmed, as if the storm had never happened, its waters unruffled by the lives it claimed. For the townspeople, life moved on. The fishing boats still set out at dawn, the markets bustled with activity, and the days folded into one another with a kind of quiet inevitability. But for those few who had lived through disaster, those who had felt the cold embrace of the river, nothing was ever quite the same. The memory of that day, of the storm that had come without warning, of the ferry sinking beneath the waves, lingered in their hearts like a shadow they could not escape. There were rumors, of course, whispers that persisted long after the storm had passed. The ones who had survived, the few who had been plucked from the water, spoke little of their ordeal. Some of them had told their stories, but always in fragments, as if they feared giving voice to the terror they had witnessed. It was as if the very act of remembering the storm, of recounting the sinking of the ferry, would somehow reopen the wounds they had tried so desperately to close. But others, those who had not been on the ferry that day, began to talk. Some wondered if the storm had not been as natural as it seemed. Was it, in some way, a warning, a message from the river itself? There were stories of strange occurrences, of things seen just before the storm struck, a dark shape beneath the water, an eerie calm before the wind howled to life. But these stories were passed in whispers, as if to speak them too loudly would somehow invoke the same terror they were trying to forget. The town went about its business, but there was a lingering unease, a sense that the past was not as far behind them as they thought. It was in the air, in the way people glanced nervously at the river, as if they half expected to see something or someone emerge from its depths. But it wasn't until the 1920s, more than 4 decades after the wreck, that the river's secrets began to surface again. The town had long since forgotten about the ferry disaster, but the wreck, hidden beneath the water, was not as easily forgotten. The first expeditions to recover the wreckage had been launched years earlier, but each attempt had been unsuccessful. The river had swallowed the ferry whole, and no matter how hard they tried, no one could seem to reach it. But in the 1920s, new technology made the impossible seem within reach. Divers, equipped with better tools, went down into the murky depths of the river, hoping to find what had been lost all those years ago. As they descended, the water grew darker and colder. The pressure of the deep, the silence of the depths, it was a world apart from the one they knew. And there, in the heart of the river, they found it, the wreck of the ferry, just as it had been left, frozen in time beneath the surface. But it wasn't just a ferry they found. They found something else, something far more unsettling. The wheelhouse, the command center of the ship, had remained almost entirely intact. It was as if the storm had spared it, leaving it undisturbed while the rest of the ferry was torn apart. And inside the wheelhouse, Among the wreckage, the divers made a discovery that no one could have anticipated: a relic, something that seemed completely out of place in the context of the disaster. It was an object, small, personal, and it stood as a stark reminder that there was something more to this story, something that had been left behind, hidden from the world for decades. The discovery of the relic sent shockwaves through the town. What had it been doing there? What connection did it have to the ferry, to the passengers, to the disaster? The object seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, yet its presence in the wreckage was anything but. The object, when carefully examined, was found to be an old journal, a small leather-bound book, its pages worn and yellowed with age. The journal's discovery immediately raised more questions than it answered. It was clear that someone had been aboard the ferry that day whose presence had never been accounted for. No name had appeared on the passenger list. No record existed of their existence. The journal was a link to a person whose identity had been erased, whose life had been swept away by the river. Just like the wreckage itself, the journal, once retrieved from the wheelhouse, became the center of intense scrutiny. Historians, researchers, and even local officials examined it, hoping to uncover some clue as to who this mysterious person had been. The writing was faint but legible, the ink barely visible in some places, but still holding on to the memories of the past. As the journal was carefully transcribed, it began to tell a story, a fragmented story, like the pieces of a broken mirror. The man who had written the journal, it seemed, was not a passenger in the traditional sense. His entry spoke of a man who had been running from something, someone. The journal was filled with account of fear, of paranoia, of a life spent on the run. The more the journal was read, the more it became clear that the man aboard the ferry that day had been hiding, erasing his own past, and possibly attempting to start anew. But why had he been aboard the ferry at all? Why had he chosen this moment, this storm, to make his escape? The answers were buried within the cryptic words of the journal, and as researchers pored over its pages, they began to uncover a strange series of events leading up to the day of the ferry disaster. The man, identified later as Samuel Grayson, had been a fugitive, a criminal who had escaped justice time and time again. His journal revealed the grim details of his life, a life built on lies, deceit, and betrayal. Samuel Grayson had been involved in shady dealings, and the journal suggested that he had been a part of a larger criminal network operating in the region. But what was he doing on the ferry that day? Was it just a coincidence, or had he been trying to escape something far worse than the storm? The journal was tantalizing in its detail, but only raised more questions. What had happened between Grayson and the ferry's crew? Why had he chosen to disappear? Was he running from something or someone? The deeper they delved into the journal, the more unsettling the story became. Grayson's writings began to hint at a much darker reality than anyone had anticipated. He had been aboard the ferry not as an ordinary passenger, but as a man desperate to disappear from the world. The ferry, the storm, the disaster, it had all been part of his plan. The journal suggested that Grayson had been seeking to erase himself, to wipe his past from the record, to start a new life in a place where no one knew him. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The storm had come out of nowhere. The ferry had capsized, and Grayson had gone down with it. His disappearance was not an accident. It had been part of a much larger scheme, one that had been interrupted by the very forces of nature he had hoped to outrun. As the journal story unfolded, it became clear that Samuel Grayson had not been a mere passenger in the disaster. He had been a central figure, a man whose presence aboard the ferry had been deliberately hidden, erased from the official records. His name had never appeared on the passenger list, and yet he had been there, playing a role in the disaster far more significant than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the journal, the relic left behind in the wheelhouse, was a chilling reminder that some stories, no matter how deep they are buried, cannot remain hidden forever. Grayson's life, his crimes, and his death have been lost to history, erased by the river, by the storm, and by the passage of time. But the river had not forgotten. It had kept its secrets hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone to uncover them. And now, in the quiet depths of the river, the story of Samuel Grayson was slowly coming to light. The journal had provided the first real glimpse into the life of a man who had been lost to history, a man whose name had been deliberately erased from a record. The mystery was far from over. It had only just begun. The discovery of the journal had cast a long shadow over the town, one that stretched far beyond the wreckage of the ferry and its tragic end. As the first whispers of Samuel Grayson's existence began to spread, they carried with them a weight that seemed to sink into the bones of the town's history. The official records, the town's memory, had been altered. Grayson's name, until now absent, suddenly loomed large in the minds of those who had lived through the disaster. No one knew quite what to make of it. How could someone with such a dark past, someone whose name had never been recorded, simply vanish like that? What did this mean for the town? For the tragedy? For the people who had been left behind? The more the journal was examined, the more questions arose. Grayson had not been a mere bystander on that fateful day, not simply another soul lost in the chaos of the storm. The journal's pages painted a portrait of a man who had lived a life built on deception, one that stretched back far beyond the day of the disaster. It was clear from the first few pages that Samuel Grayson had been running, not just from the law, but from his own past. His life had been filled with secrets, shadows that he had spent years trying to outrun. The journal, with its cryptic and fragmented entries, gave only glimpses of a man who had long since become a ghost in his own life, a man trying to erase his very existence. For the people who lived in the town, this revelation was nothing short of disorienting. They had believed the ferry disaster to be just that, a tragic accident, a freak event caused by a storm. But now, with Grayson's name appearing in the pages of the journal, they began to wonder if something else had been at play. Was it possible that the storm, the disaster, and the ferry's tragic sinking were all part of a much darker plan? Could Grayson have been involved in something that had been hidden from view? The more they dug into his history, the more the town began to unravel the twisted tale of a man whose life had been so carefully obscured that no one had even known he existed. Grayson had never been a stranger to trouble. As the journal made painfully clear, he had spent much of his adult life entangled in a series of criminal activities. The details were sketchy, the entries unclear, but one thing was evident. Samuel Grayson had been involved with a criminal syndicate operating just outside the town. This syndicate was not the type of group that could be easily ignored. It had deep ties to the region, and its reach extended far beyond the town's borders. The journal revealed enough to suggest that Grayson had been an integral part of this group. Perhaps not the leader, but certainly a key figure who had known too much. His involvement in these illicit dealings was the kind of thing that could ruin lives, destroy families, and cause untold damage. And the more the townspeople learned about him, the clearer it became that his disappearance had been no accident. There was a sense of unease that came with his discovery, as though the very fabric of the town's history had been torn open, revealing a dark undercurrent that had long been buried. Samuel Grayson's name, once absent from the town's records, now seemed to haunt every conversation, every whisper. And as people began to recall the details of the ferry disaster, they started to wonder, had they all been lied to? Had something more sinister occurred that day? Something that had been kept from him for all these years? One of the most troubling aspects of the journal was its suggestion that Grayson had been on the ferry for a reason far more personal than simply trying to escape his past. The more the journal was studied, the clearer it became that Grayson had not been simply trying to flee to a new life. He had been trying to disappear, to erase himself completely from history. But why had he chosen the ferry? Why had he chosen that day? The answers were buried deep within the pages of the journal, but they were difficult to decipher. It was as though Grayson had written the journal with the intention of obscuring the truth, of keeping something hidden from the world. Some passages were vague, others contradictory. It was as if Grayson had been writing in a language only he could understand, hiding pieces of himself in the lines of the journal, hoping that no one would ever be able to put the puzzle together. There were references to a man named Harlan Winters, a name that had never appeared in the town's history books. Winters was mentioned in several entries, and it became clear that he was someone important to Grayson, someone whose influence extended beyond the world of crime. The journal alluded to a complex relationship between the two men, one that seemed both professional and personal. The cryptic nature of the writing made it impossible to fully understand the nature of their connection, but the few pieces of information that were available hinted at something far more dangerous than mere criminal involvement. Winters appeared to be someone Grayson feared, someone who betrayed, or perhaps someone who betrayed him. The journal made it clear that Grayson had not just been trying to escape the law. He had been trying to escape a network of people who were willing to go to any lengths to silence him. The more the journal was examined, the more it became apparent that the ferry disaster had not been a random event. There were references to the storm, to the sense of impending doom that had hung over Grayson in the days leading up to the fateful voyage. Grayson had written about the storm as though it were a force he could not control, something that had been set in motion long before he boarded the ferry. It was almost as if he knew the disaster was coming, as if he had been part of a larger plan that had been set in motion to ensure his disappearance. The journal suggested that Grayson had known the storm would hit, that he'd use it as a way to disappear without a trace, to vanish completely from the world. But the real twist came in the final pages of the journal, where Grayson's writings took on an even darker tone. In these final entries, he spoke of betrayal, one that would seal his fate. It became clear that Grayson had not just been trying to escape his past. He had been running from something far worse. There were references to a deal gone wrong, to a plan that had failed. Grayson had not just been trying to disappear. He had been trying to flee a situation he could not control, a trap that had been set for him by those he had once trusted. The storm, the wreck, the sinking of the ferry, it had all been part of this elaborate scheme. The disaster was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to rid the world of Samuel Grayson, to ensure that he would never be able to tell his story. The river had claimed him, but not in the way anyone had thought. As the journal's final revelation sank in, the town was left with a sense of unease that could not be shaken. The mystery of the ferry disaster had taken on a new, more disturbing dimension. The storm, the sinking, the missing bodies. It all began to make sense in a way it hadn't before. Samuel Grayson's disappearance had been no random event. It had been a calculated decision, a desperate move by a man who had known his time had run out. The river had not just claimed his life. It had claimed his story, his legacy, his very existence. But even in death, Grayson's name could not be erased completely. The journal, now in the hands of the town's historians, had brought his story back to life, and in doing so, had raised more questions than it had answered. Who had orchestrated his disappearance? Who had been involved in this dark web of betrayal and lies? And what did this all mean for the town? What were the consequences of uncovering this long-buried truth? The mystery of Samuel Grayson, the missing passenger, and the ferry disaster had only deepened. What had seemed like a simple tragedy, an accident caused by an unexpected storm, was now a much darker tale, one of betrayal, fear, and violence. The journal had peeled back the layers of history, revealing a story that no one had been prepared for, a story that would haunt the town for generations to come. As the days passed after the journal was discovered, the sense of unease in the town deepened, taking root in ways no one had anticipated. The more the townspeople learned about Samuel Grayson and the shadowy figures he'd been connected to, the harder it became to shake the feeling that the storm, the wreck, and the subsequent silence surrounding the disaster were not just tragic events. They were pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that had been left unsolved for far too long. The discovery of the journal had turned what was once a simple maritime disaster into a mystery that threatened to unravel the town's carefully constructed sense of peace. The story of the ferry disaster, of the storm and the lives lost, had always been told in a way that softened the edges, made it easier to digest. People had accepted the narrative. The ferry had capsized, the storm come out of nowhere, and that was the end of it. But now, with the journal casting a long shadow over the story, the truth seemed more elusive than ever before. The river, once a calm, predictable entity, had revealed itself as something much more treacherous, its depths hiding secrets that no one had imagined. The first ripple of suspicion came from the townsfolk themselves. They had always believed the storm was an act of nature, a rare but entirely possible event. But the more they learned about Grayson's life, the more they began to wonder if there had been something more to it. Could the storm have been part of a plan? Could it have been orchestrated to ensure Grayson's disappearance? To rid the world of a man who knew too much? The journal didn't provide clear answers. It never did. But it hinted at something far darker, something that went beyond the simple concept of an accidental tragedy. Grayson had written about a deal gone wrong, and his vague allusions of betrayal only served to deepen the mystery. Was the storm simply an accident, or had someone, or something, manipulated the weather, the timing, the conditions, to ensure that Grayson's secrets were buried along with him? The more people thought about it, the more questions arose. The town, once a quiet and unassuming place, now found itself at the center of a riddle that seemed impossible to solve. The local authorities, at first, had dismissed the journal's significance. They had been content to let the disaster remain in the past, a dark chapter of history that no one wanted to revisit. But as the journal's contents became more widely known, it became clear that things could not be so easily swept aside. The town's leaders were faced with the uncomfortable reality that they had been complicit in erasing Grayson's name from the records. They had allowed the disaster to be reduced to a series of simple facts. A storm, a sinking ferry, a handful of bodies recovered. But in the wake of the journal's revelation, the simplicity of this narrative no longer seemed adequate. The disaster was no longer just an unfortunate event. It was a piece of a larger, more dangerous puzzle, one that threatened to expose the underbelly of the town's own history. As the days turned into weeks, the search for answers grew more urgent. The town, once unified in its grief and its shared memory of the disaster, now found itself divided. On one side were those who wanted to leave the past in the past, to allow the river to keep its secrets and to move on. These people argued that the discovery of the journal only complicated matters, that it was better let the tragedy fade into history, as all tragedies eventually did. But on the other side were those who felt that the truth needed to be uncovered, that the river's silence could no longer be tolerated. These were the people who believed that Grayson's name, his story, and the real reason for Ferry's demise had to be brought to light. To leave it buried, they argued, would be to let the river claim yet another victim, one whose life and death deserved to be acknowledged. The search for answers led people to revisit the wreck itself. Divers had already made attempts to locate and recover the ferry's remains, but the conditions were treacherous, and the wreck had been elusive, hiding just out of reach. Now, with renewed interest in the disaster, efforts to investigate the wreck grew more determined. More resources were allocated and new technology was employed, including sonar scans and advanced diving equipment, in the hope of uncovering what had been left behind all those years ago. The divers who descended into murky depths of the river came back with more pieces of the puzzle, scraps of wood, pieces of metal, and more importantly, the realization that the wreck had not settled as they had originally thought. It was still shifting, still resisting the river's grasp, as if the ferry itself were alive, holding on to its secrets with a fierce determination. Among the pieces recovered from the wreck, one particular discovery stood out. It was a set of weathered documents, their edges frayed, their ink faded but still legible. These papers, buried beneath the wreckage, seemed to have survived against all odds, preserved by the river's depths. When the documents were brought to the surface, the excitement was palpable. Were they related to the ferry's operation? Were they part of the ship's manifest or records? But as the pages were carefully examined, the truth became clearer. These were not official records. They were personal papers, letters, contracts, and notes, belonging to someone who had been intimately involved with the ferry, but not in any official capacity. The handwriting on the documents was unmistakably Grayson's. The letters revealed more details about the criminal network he had been involved with and the kind of people he had crossed paths with. They mentioned figures with names that had never appeared in any public records, men and women who seemed to have connections not just in the town, but in larger, more dangerous circles. The paper spoke of a deal gone wrong, a betrayal that had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the ferry's sinking. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that the ferry disaster was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger web of intrigue involving criminal syndicates, corrupt officials, and the kind of hidden forces that lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. The storm, it seemed, had not just been an act of nature. It had been the final piece in a carefully orchestrated plan to remove a threat, to silence someone who knew too much. And at the center of it all was Samuel Grayson, the man who had been erased from the records, the man whose life had been buried beneath the weight of history. But his name, his story, had been resurrected. His secrets had come to the surface. And the town, which had long since moved on from the disaster, was now faced with the unsettling reality that the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation continued, the emotional toll on the townspeople became more apparent. The sense of betrayal was palpable. Betrayal not just by Grayson, who had lived a life built on lies, but by the very institutions they had trusted, the officials who had been complicit in covering up the truth, the leaders who had swept the disaster under the rug. All of them had played a role in keeping the secrets hidden. The town, once a place of safety, now seemed tainted, its history rewritten, its memory distorted by the shadows of what had been left out. For some, the discovery of the truth was liberating. It offered a sense of justice, of closure that had been denied for so long. For others, it was a wound that would never heal. The Ferry disaster, which had once been a simple tragedy, had now become a symbol of a much larger betrayal, one that would forever change the town's perception of its past. And as the town grappled with the weight of these revelations, the river remained silent. It had given up its secrets, but it had not offered any answers. The storm had taken its toll, but the river, as always, continued to flow, its depths holding on to more stories, more truths, more forgotten histories. The mystery of the Ferry disaster, of Samuel Grayson's life and death, was far from over. It had only just begun. As the revelations continued to mount, the town found itself increasingly unsettled by the growing sense that it had been living in the shadow of something far darker than it had ever imagined. The discovery of Grayson's journal, the recovered documents, the cryptic nature of the storm, it all pointed to something far more insidious than just an unfortunate accident. The people who had once accepted the disaster as an uncontrollable act of nature now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. What had happened on that stormy day in 1876? What had truly driven the ferry to its tragic end? As the town's collective memory began to unravel, a deeper sense of loss took root. Not just a loss of life, but the loss of trust in the institutions and systems that had always been relied upon to safeguard the truth. It wasn't just a disaster that had been hidden. It was a long history of secrets that had been woven into the town's very fabric. Samuel Grayson, whose name had only recently resurfaced, was just one small part of a much larger story. The more the town delved into his life, the more it became clear that his disappearance was not just a personal tragedy. It was a part of a much broader pattern of deceit, betrayal, and corruption that had festered in the shadows for years. The Ferry disaster, far from being an isolated event, was simply the final act in a long-running drama that had been kept hidden from the public eye for generations. The documents that had been recovered from the wreckage spoke of more than just Grayson's criminal ties. They revealed a network of individuals, many of whom were highly placed in the town's leadership, who had been complicit in shielding the truth, in burying the disaster, and in erasing Grayson's name from the records. Those who had died that day were not the only victims. The town itself had been a victim of its own complacency, of its refusal to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. In the wake of these discoveries, the people who had once been content to live their lives in quiet oblivion were now confronted with the reality of their history. The town, once a peaceful, insular place, had been built on a foundation of lies. What had seemed like a simple tragedy had now become a reflection of a much deeper corruption that had taken root long before the storm. The storm had been the trigger, but the true cause of the disaster lay much deeper, in the intertwined lives of those who had orchestrated it, in the men and women who had turned a blind eye to the suffering that had been allowed to fester for years. The ferry's sinking was not the result of nature's whim. It was the result of a carefully constructed plan, one that had been set in motion long before the storm clouds had begun to gather. Grayson had been a part of that plan, but he was not the only one who had been swept away by it. The disaster had been a calculated move in a larger game, one in which the town's leadership had played a pivotal role. As the investigation deepened, the town's darkest secrets began to surface, one by one. The more they uncovered about Grayson's criminal activities and his ties to the syndicate, the clearer it became that his disappearance had been orchestrated by a group of powerful individuals who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. These individuals, once respected members of the community, now stood exposed for their roles in the deception that had plagued the town for decades. The journal had been the first step in uncovering the layers of corruption, but it was only the beginning. More evidence began to emerge, from hidden ledgers to confidential letters, all which painted a picture of a town that had long since sold its soul in exchange for power, influence, and money. The Ferry disaster, which had once been considered a simple act of fate, was now revealed to be a tragic consequence of the greed and ambition of those who had sought to profit from the misfortune of others. The recovery of these documents marked a turning point in the town's collective consciousness. What had once been whispered in the dark corners of taverns and quiet conversations now stood exposed in the light of day. The town as a whole had been complicit in the silencing of its own history, in the erasure of the lives lost in the storm, and in the suppression of the truth. The town's leaders had been responsible for sweeping the disaster under the rug, for allowing the families of the lost passengers to suffer in silence while their loved ones were forgotten. The river had swallowed them, but it had also swallowed the town's soul, leaving it adrift in a sea of guilt, shame, and unresolved grief. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Grayson's death, along with the other passengers aboard the ferry, had been part of a much larger plan to eliminate a threat to the criminal network that had been operating in the shadows. Grayson, it seemed, had been a liability, someone who knew too much and could potentially expose the entire operation. His disappearance had been no accident. It had been a deliberate act to silence him, to ensure that he would never speak out about the illicit dealings that had been taking place right under the town's nose. The storm, the sinking, the missing bodies. It all fit together in a way that was chilling in its precision. The storm had been the perfect cover, the perfect excuse to explain away the disaster, to make it seem like an act of nature that no one could have predicted or prevented. But now, with the pieces of the puzzle coming together, it was clear that the storm had been just a final stroke in a much more calculated effort to cover up a much darker truth. The town, now faced with the harsh reality of what had been uncovered, was left to grapple with the consequences. How could they live with the knowledge that their own leaders had been complicit in such a terrible act? How could they reconcile the history they had been taught with the truth that was now emerging? The people who had once trusted in their institutions, in the river's safety, in the idea that their leaders had their best interests at heart, were now faced with the ugly reality that they had been lied to, manipulated, and betrayed. The ferry disaster, which had once been a tragic accident, had now become a symbol of the town's collective failure, of the ways in which the people had allowed themselves to be complicit in the erasure of the truth. The emotional toll on the survivors of the disaster was profound. Those who had lived through the storm, who had clung to the wreckage and fought for their lives, now found themselves grappling with the realization that the truth had been buried for so long. The grief that had once been solely focused on the loss of loved ones now expanded to encompass the sense of betrayal they felt toward the very community they had once called home. The people they had trusted, the leaders they had followed, had all been involved in the cover-up, in the suppression of the truth. It was a betrayal that cut deep, one that would be felt for generations. For the survivors, the ferry disaster was no longer just a personal loss. It was a loss of faith, a loss of trust, a loss of innocence. They had been left behind, not just by the storm, but by the very people who had promised to protect them. As the town began to confront the reality of its own complicity in the cover-up, the river continued to flow, indifferent to the revelations that had shaken the community to its core. The river, with its unyielding current, had carried away not just the ferry and its passengers, but the truth itself. And it was only now, after all these years, that the truth had started to surface. But even as the truth emerged from the depths, it was clear that the damage had already been done. The ferry disaster, once a simple tragedy, had become a symbol of something far more profound: the cost of silence, the price of complicity, and the weight of a history that could not be ignored. The town had been changed, irrevocably altered by the truth that had been unearthed. The lives of the survivors, the families of the lost, and the entire community had been marked by the events of that fateful day. But now, with the past finally brought into the light, they had to confront the reality of their own history. The river, once a lifeline, had become a dark mirror, reflecting back the truth that no one wanted to see. And though the truth had emerged, it was unclear whether the town could ever fully heal from the wounds it had inflicted on itself. The ferry disaster was no longer just a story of a shipwreck. It was a story of betrayal, of power, of silence, and of the cost of ignoring the truth. And for those who lived in the town, it was a story they would never forget. In the wake of the startling revelation surrounding Samuel Grayson, the ferry disaster, and the shadowy criminal web that had entangled the town for so many years, there was a palpable shift in the air. What had once seemed like a sleepy, tight-knit community now felt fractured, its illusions shattered like the wreckage of the ferry. The truth, no matter how painful, had finally come to the surface, and with it came a flood of emotions that the town was ill-prepared to deal with. Some people struggled to reconcile the new information with the version of the town's history they had always known, while others simply sought to move past it, bearing the pain once again. as if erasing it would somehow restore the peace they once had. But there was no going back, no easy way to unlearn what had been uncovered. The town's sense of self, its identity, had been irrevocably altered. For those who had lived through the disaster, the impact was especially profound. They had borne witness to the storm's fury, to the terror that had gripped the ferry as it was torn apart by the relentless force of the water. They had watched as loved ones were swallowed by the river, their faces vanishing beneath the dark waves, never to be seen again. They had been the ones who had survived, against all odds, and carried the weight of that day with them for the rest of their lives. But now, in light of the revelations that had emerged about Grayson and the shadowy forces behind disaster, their grief had deepened, and their sense of betrayal grew even more painful. The storm, which they had once thought of as a random act of nature, now seemed like the culmination of a much larger, more sinister plan. They had been used as pawns in a game they hadn't even known was being played, their suffering exploited by those who had the power to control the narrative, to erase the truth. The survivors' voices, once silent, now found a new urgency. They began to speak out, to share their experiences not just of the storm, but of the years that had followed. For decades, they had been forced to live with the knowledge that the disaster had taken something from them, something irreplaceable: loved ones, friends, family. And yet, they had been made to feel that their loss was somehow secondary, that it was something that needed to be swept under the rug for the sake of the town's peace. The discovery of the journal, the hidden documents, and the connections to the criminal syndicate had given them a sense of validation. They were no longer just victims of an unpredictable storm. They were victims of a far more calculated tragedy. Their voices, once silenced by the weight of grief, now rang out with the power of those who had been wronged. But the emotional toll of these revelations was not just felt by the survivors. The entire town, once united in its grief, now found itself divided. There were those who could not bear the weight of the truth, who preferred the comforting lie they had been told for so long. They clung to the idea that the storm had been an accident, that the deaths had been inevitable and unavoidable, and that the town's leaders had done everything they could to prevent the tragedy. The truth, with all its complexity and darkness, was too much to face. For them, it was easy to hold on to the simpler narrative, to ignore the painful reality that the disaster had been far more orchestrated than they had ever imagined. In this group were the families of those who had died, people who had held on to the hope that the loss of their loved ones had been a matter of fate, a cruel twist of nature that no one could have predicted. To them, acknowledging the full extent of the conspiracy, the involvement of the criminal network, the deliberate erasure of Grayson's name, was to acknowledge that their grief had been manipulated, that their loved ones had been sacrificed for reasons beyond their understanding. On the other side were those who felt that the truth had to be told, no matter the cost. They argued that the town owed it to the survivors, to the families of the lost, to finally bring the full story into the light. These people had come to terms with the fact that their town was not the idyllic, peaceful place they had always believed it to be. It was a place where corruption had taken root, where powerful people had played games with the lives of the vulnerable. To them, the truth was not just about uncovering the past. It was about setting things right, about offering some form of justice, however elusive. But even within this group, there was a growing sense of unease. What exactly would the truth bring? Would it heal the wounds of the survivors? Or would it deepen the scars of a town already marked by tragedy? Could the town ever truly recover from the weight of its own history? As these divisions grew, the investigation into the Ferry disaster continued, driven by the desire to understand not just the events of that day, but the forces that had shaped them. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that the town's history had been deliberately obscured. Grayson, who had once been seen as little more than a footnote in the disaster story, was now at the center of a web of deception that spanned decades. His life, his death, and the cover-up that followed had been part of a larger narrative of control, manipulation, and greed. The Ferry, it seemed, had not just been a victim of nature, it had been a victim of a carefully constructed plan to eliminate those who stood in the way of powerful interests. The criminal syndicate that Grayson had been involved with was not just a local operation. It had connections far beyond the town's borders. The documents that had been recovered from the wreckage were only the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation dug deeper, it became clear that the syndicate's reach extended into the highest levels of government, law enforcement, and business. The storm, The Ferry disaster and the ensuing cover-up were not isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger network of corruption and power, one that had manipulated the lives of countless individuals for its own benefit. Grayson had been a cog in this machine, but his disappearance had been the catalyst that had set the truth in motion. His betrayal, his desire to disappear, had created a ripple effect that was now forcing the town to confront the ugly truth about the forces that had controlled it. For the people who had lived in the town for generations, this discovery was a bitter pill to swallow. They had always prided themselves on the community they had built, the trust they had placed in one another. But now, that trust seemed to have been shattered, eroded by the discovery of how deeply the town's history had been tainted. The leaders they had looked up to, the institutions they had relied upon, had been complicit in the cover-up, in the silencing of the truth. The very foundations of the town, once considered solid and unshakable, now seemed fragile and vulnerable. How could they rebuild after everything that had been uncovered? Was it even possible to restore the sense of unity that had once defined their community, or had that too been lost in the storm? The emotional fallout from these revelations was not just about the past. It was about the future. The town was at a crossroads. Would it continue to turn a blind eye to its history, clinging to the comforting lies that had been told for so long? Or would it confront the darkness, face the consequences of its actions, and try to rebuild in the light of the truth? The survivors of the disaster, who had once been content to carry their pain in silence, now found themselves forced to decide whether they were willing to speak out, to demand justice for those who had been lost and for those who had been erased. Could they ever truly move on, or would the scars of the past continue to haunt them? The town had always been defined by its connection to the river. The river had been its lifeblood, its means of commerce, its source of sustenance. But now, the river had become a symbol of something else, of loss, of betrayal, of secrets buried too deep for too long. It was a reminder that the past could not be ignored, that the sins of the past could not be swept away by the current. The town could no longer hide behind its memories, its myths, its convenient narratives. The river had given up its secrets, and with them came the painful realization that the truth, no matter how ugly, could not be buried again. And so, as the town stood at the edge of this new reality, the question loomed large. What would happen next? Would the truth ultimately heal, or would it tear the town apart? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The Ferry disaster, the storm, and the secrets that had been buried beneath the river's surface had changed everything. The past could never be erased. It was now up to the town to decide whether it would face it head-on or allow it to continue to haunt them for years to come.